First of all, thank you all so very much for giving up your lovely warm evening. We haven't had a warm day for a bit. And we really appreciate you showing us your support. And I'd like to thank the respondents that we've invited. We are all aware of these barriers in some ways. Some of you have first-hand experience in these. So although it's very nice to see this support, we also want support from the wider demographic, the demographic that really dominates architecture. We've had very kind 6 guest respondents who've decided to join us to kick off the discussion.
Automatically judging it on a body of work and not considering the person behind the work and the things that they may have faced. You're discounting so many people. That's something that I went through. You're discounting so many people, and I think that is one of the most important intersections that we need to look at, is this idea of class, and the way in which the 7-year process has not been looked at in so long, and it's so rigid, and we keep saying to people who are not, we keep saying to people, come into the profession, but we're not actually looking at the profession and saying, is this a way that everyone can move through? And I just think that that's such a massive thing in terms of looking at this idea of you have to submit a portfolio, but a lot of people have issues getting to that. So I really do think that those are the key concerns that I always like to bring up when people start to talk about retention and people moving through, because it really is that idea of intersections and looking at the whole picture, which class is, I think, one that we do not touch on enough, and such a massive barrier.
Oh God, where to start? So I joined the ARB, so I'm not an architect, I have no background in the built environment, but as the ridiculously long CV says, I've got quite a long background in professional regulation and looking to understand what happens within professions. And I guess there are lots of disadvantages of not being an architect. The advantage is that when I came in 2020, you're data driven. So lots of people are saying there are problems with bias, with bullying, with cultural problems, with length of journey, and I start with a kind of, what's the data say? What does the data say? And the data says there is a problem. I mean, you've got to be really, really unconsciously incompetent to not think there's a problem. You know, you look at it, you know, what, 31% of architects are female. I mean, there's a problem. You look at white people overrepresented, there's a problem. You look at the intersectionality issues, and 4% of the population is black or black African, 1% of architects on the register are black or black African. So there's a problem. So we just need to move on quickly to go, well, why? And I guess people in regulators have traditionally correctly said, well, the problem's multifactorial. But incorrectly have then said, well, we can't fix it because it's multifactorial. It's society's problem. Rather than say, okay, it's multifactorial, it's very difficult, but what can we do? And I guess we've been trying to say, what can we do? And I don't think we'll get everything right. In fact, we'll get a lot wrong, but we'll try and address some of these issues, because there are things that clearly are within our gift, subject to statutory powers and consultation. So I guess the most obvious one is this issue around about attrition rates in education and training. So there's clearly a problem there. Now, just as an anecdote from pharmacy, we looked at why the pass rates for the national licensing exam were horrendous for particularly black African pharmacy students. Very good for Asian students, very good for white students. And there was a typical, I think probably colonial view that it was because of pedagogy. If you were from a black African country, you might be taught in a more rote way because of history. And actually the problem is you come into universities here, it's not intelligence, but it's because you've been taught differently. But actually we ended up, and quant research doesn't help you, but qual does. So we did some qualitative research, and actually, back to your point, what we found was that the black African students or black British students were poor. And so when they came out of the lecture and they were finding that the lectures were really complex, they didn't have peer groups because they were doing their second jobs or their third jobs. So the issue there was not race, it wasn't pedagogy, it wasn't origins of academic excellence, it was poverty. And so the evidence there was that universities were doing lots to get people into universities, but nothing to support them through the journey. So this is where kind of my obsession with evidence is, what does the evidence tell us? And it tells us there's a problem, and it tells us there's a problem in architecture. So obviously, if we kind of move on to the sorts of things that we've been trying to explore, one of them is this issue about the structure of architectural education and training, and the view, I think rightly, that the architectural education in the UK has been seen as a gold standard. But there's a couple of issues with that. The first is, I think it's been seen as a gold standard by people who've been through the process and the people who set up and designed it. But I think the evidence is that actually there's great ways of delivering architectural education and training globally. And lots of people in the UK have been wanting to do different things in different ways. So what are the barriers? And I think removing a presumption around status quo is really important for us. And as a regulator, being very explicit that our job was not to design education training, our job is to quality assure it. Our job is to say to the public, if you come out of your journey, are you competent? And there are lots of different ways of achieving that potentially, but our job is to say, are we comfortable, are we competent? And that's partly the reason why we've said in future you will no longer need an undergraduate part-one qualification. You might very well need one, or may very well have one, but one of the oddities of the current system is you can come from, say, the United States and have done an undergraduate degree and do a master's over here and a part 3, and then have to go all the way back to the beginning to do an undergraduate degree because we work on a bolt-on system, and it seemed to us kind of illogical. I think we obviously made those changes, and we'll see. But I don't necessarily say it's going to guarantee increased access, but it will provide opportunities for people who've done different routes in, who have spent lots of time doing design, but maybe not done an undergraduate degree, but want to become architects. The other area where I think other colleagues have talked about is this access to employment. And we know there's a problem. We know there's a problem not just anecdotally, but as we see apprenticeship degrees set off. There's lots of emerging evidence that they're high quality, but they're not increasing access. And they're not increasing access because the presumption is you will have a job. So the same problem that we were talking about earlier about presenting portfolios, if you are confident and you've got connections and you know how to get a job, you'll get a job, and then you'll get the apprenticeship. So there's no silver bullets, and back to this point about it's multifactorial, which means everyone needs to try lots of different things collectively. So one of the other things, I think historically we've taken the view is professional practical experience, what's traditionally been the 2 years, we don't fund it. Government doesn't fund it. So it's in that box marked, it's a bit too difficult, but actually back to the strategy that we're trying to follow is it may be too difficult, but what can we do? So that's why some of you may know we set up a commission about a month and a half ago, 2 months ago, to look at professional practical experience, and said to them, you tell us what the issues are, you go out and look at research so that we're not making presumptions. So that will cover everything from what might be the alternative ways of funding it, what are the barriers that people genuinely find rather than the ones we presume, what can we do to consider alternative bits of experience. So does it have to be in a practice, does it have to be after your undergraduate degree, does it have to be directly within art? So those sorts of things that we don't have the answers to. In universities there is pretty poor culture, and some of that culture is I think directly related to the way in which it's taught. It is the way in which it's taught a feature of the practice of architecture or is it the other way around? So what causes what? Is it because people are coming out with university through a crit structure, a confrontational structure, they go into practice and they take those behaviours, or is it because you're taught to get ready for the sorts of behaviours that you would expect in practice? And I don't know, but I think what we're trying to understand is what is the culture. You hear a lot of people talk about the culture in practices, but that's anecdotal, and I think from our perspective, when we look at the code of practice and conduct, what are the behaviours we're trying to create? What are the behaviours that professionals are trying to create, and what are the appropriate leaders for us as a... There's loads of stuff I think we can do without going beyond our statutory role, and there's lots of stuff we will get wrong, but it would be even more wrong not to try it and to assess it and to get an evidence base about whether it works.
To what extent do we think about this broadening that you were talking about, this enriching of what architecture is, to allow a wider debate, I think is really important. And I really like that part of it, about thinking of architecture as a much more diverse set of activities and functions than just it is a white male designing a very tall building, which is like the picture. If someone says architecture, if you Google architect, that's what comes up as the image. But that's not who we are, that's not what architecture is, and that's not what it needs to be. So I really like just making us think differently about how we get different people to the table, to be part of the team, and to be making different places that have all sorts of people in it. So I really like you making me think.
Thank you so much. I think it's hugely important to have a woman such as yourself who is in power to be able to employ, to be able to decide, make decisions that would influence the future of practice. And so we're really privileged to have you here actually, because there aren't many women like yourself in the field of architecture. And I like the point which resonates with us of trying to think about, how perhaps your employees who think they're not part of architecture anymore because they feel it's such a narrowly defined profession that as soon as they do urban design, they're not architects anymore. And I think, we really need to have conversations about expanding the role of the architect, who we are, what is represented by that. And also I like your feedback on trying to address the race issue, because as you know, I teach architecture, especially my Part 1 female minority ethnic students find it really difficult to get jobs, and I'm hoping through Flame Collective and spreading the words, we could somehow connect those students who might fall out of the system because they can't find anyone to employ. For us to be able to connect that demographic with people like yourselves, to be able to open that up would be fantastic.
People who aren't in the room, the people who you're trying to get here, I think not all of them, but I think the problem is lots of people who are in that position don't understand that the reason they don't have diverse practices is because they are not looking at it in the right way. They don't see them as the problem. And I've had lots of conversations with people who run big practices, and they say outrageously terrible things like, well, I didn't think that there was anyone in my practice I could promote who wasn't a white man. Like, I don't have to say the last bit, but that's what they mean. Like, really? You are not looking properly. But genuinely, there's a lot of people who just don't see that it's their problem.
And that was one of the comments from an architect who's white and who had practiced for 50 years. And his comment was, what hard-working, never held anyone back. Even just try to be an efficient architect. We fear that's not enough, being an efficient architect. There's much more to this. There's that representation, who represents the practice, is a big issue.
I think it's great that you've identified, these 6 points of progression that you can see. But I think just taking comments from the various things that have been said here, and relating it to my own, life and career as an architect when I was studying, there really wasn't anyone who looked like me that was. But I think that, first and foremost, the definition of success needs to change. I often tell my students, Westminster, that, you know, first of all, the architects, I think, are some of the smartest people in the world. And I think if you've gotten to the point where you're doing your part 3 or you're doing your part 1, you should very much pat yourself on the back and say, well done to me for getting that far. And especially if you are a person from an underrepresented background. I mean, good on you. You know what you've had to get through just to get there, to that point. So definitions of success, I think, are really important. It isn't just about, you know, qualifying, becoming the architect, building. It's about just your journey. The journey is really important, and we need to value that, you know, as a community, as an environment. That's the first thing. The second thing I think that might be supportive to what you're doing is, you know, one of the issues around our demographic or underrepresented groups is the fact that it is seen as not being something that can have financial reward. You know, if you get, you know, one of the reasons for not hiring from different demographics is, well, you know, where's their network, right? Who's going to get that job, right? But the world's changed, all right? The clients of today and tomorrow look like us. They're very different, very diverse, very often female. And so that narrative has to change. And I would encourage you within what you're doing is to somehow, if you could tie it to a financial element, if those statistics can tie up with what are the financial benefits when you diversify your practice. If you're saying in your statistics that, oh, when you do this, you get 35% more productivity, you get 50% more retention, those kinds of things really count. And those are the things that the wider, the dominant demographic is going to listen to and work to.
It's like, how do we actually understand the complexity of intersectionality? And I'm really interested in what the next steps of FAME's work could be. And there's so many initiatives that have come up recently. And I love the point you made in it about how it is changing, like the whole profession is changing, the future of clients, the future of the profession is changing. And like there's initiatives like the GLA is supporting this practice support program for practices. There's so many things like Accelerate that are like changing who has access to even thinking about architecture as a viable option for them. And I'm just really curious as to how FAME's work can like stitch into these different initiatives or has the potential to connect them up. Because I think that's really exciting. And also, I think as the exhibition travels to different places to make people more aware of this has huge potential. And it'd be really great to see how that path changes or evolves with each subsequent, iteration. So.
Architects or minority ethnics and their navigation of the barriers. And I'm going to jump onto Annette's point because they connect a little bit about how we define success and who is it that we're celebrating, whose success are we celebrating, and to be able to have that positive mindset of Kutsai about your intersectionality representation and the importance of that, and we've tried to do that in our exhibition, and how vital it is to be able to always consider that in terms of barriers in architecture that we are discussing, and how it becomes the main focal point of the research, and how people are represented. And then I'm going to move on to Hilary, and I remember your own reflection about how things could change perhaps in employment of your own practice, and so some food for thoughts about what is the lens of experience of each individual, so how people are experiencing things differently. Someone from a white female background's experience may be very different from a female of minority ethnic, and acknowledging those differences of experiences. So Hugh, a lot of things that you've covered there, and I appreciate that the ARB's role isn't about, I guess, shaping how architects are trained. However, the policies that you're able to input on or shape is very, you have the power to do that, and we're really happy that you could join in the conversation, because it sounds like acknowledging that there are issues is the first hurdle that you're facing as well from the members. But the data speaks otherwise, and I really appreciate and welcome your kind of the research to investigate those issues that you have faced in the issues that you've seen in the data of lack of diversity and how you address that. And also the recent announcement of how to become an architect, the changes in the policies. I acknowledge that although it may not be the silver bullet to change everything, but we really welcome the fact that there is an alternative, and that you, as an organisation, are thinking about perhaps how we could think about expanding and proposing alternative modes of training. Nijay, thank you again for your input, and really appreciate that initial support that the AA and the RIBA co-hosting our very first or the second symposium, public symposium, and good advice on how we could take fame forward. Of the roundtable, so yeah, please spread the word. Please share your experience of the exhibition, and yeah, we're looking for hosts around the country, so we'd really like to make it a travelling exhibition to have more conversations like this for a change, you know. So thank you, really appreciate your time.